finishing the speech I'm gonna give. I just had the sentence in my head. I've got to finish it. Okay. Good. I finished it. So thank you very much. Feel very honoured to be invited to the, I think, inaugural meeting of this exciting new group of freedom, free speech loving people. I'm the founder of the Free Speech Union, which was set up in February of 2020 to defend free speech in the UK, and we've been very busy. We've attracted now nearly 11,000 members, and we've got 16 members of staff. My COO, Sigrun Olafsdottir, who is Icelandic, is sitting in the front row. She's been showing me around this beautiful city of yours, although it's quite cold. I'm delighted that a similar group has been created in Iceland. I wanted to talk today about what I think the biggest risk to liberty is and will be over the coming decades, and what we can do to resist it, what we can do to push back. So around Christmas time this year, a few weeks ago, the British journalist Christopher Snowdon posted a lengthy Twitter thread that reproduced the projections of various UK modelling teams in the run-up to the previous Christmas, Christmas 2021. Many of them linked to SAGE, the scientific body that advises the British government on pandemic responses. And the models that were produced in Christmas 2021 showed a range of outcomes in terms of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths from COVID-19 that the new Omicron variant was likely to result in if the British government failed to lock down over Christmas. This was in Christmas 2021. And these projections were, in the jargon of the modelling trade, reasonable worst-case scenarios, or as the UK Health Security Agency put it, a range of plausible scenarios. This is quite important, and I'll go into more detail about what that means in a second. And as the journalist Christopher Snowdon gleefully pointed out, none of these scenarios materialized. So none of these warnings, these dire apocalyptic warnings produced by all these people clamoring for the UK to impose a lockdown in Christmas 2021, none of these projections materialized. And Boris Johnson held his nerve. He imposed something called Plan B, which was fairly minor restrictions, but he resisted imposing another full-blown lockdown. And not only did these supposedly plausible scenarios fail to materialize, but the actual numbers of hospitalizations and deaths that were projected to occur didn't occur. They weren't anywhere near even the lowest estimates in the range produced by these scientific modelling teams. Neil Ferguson, for instance, some of you may be familiar with Neil Ferguson. He's been called Professor Lockdown. He does lead a modelling team at Imperial College London, which produced various apocalyptic predictions in a report now famous called Report 9, published at the beginning of March in 2020, which was a big contributory factor in the decision, not just of the UK, but other countries around the world, to lock down in March 2020. So he told The Guardian in the run-up to Christmas 2021 that, quote, most of the projections we have right now are that the Omicron wave could very substantially overwhelm the National Health Service, getting up to peak levels of admissions of 10,000 people per day. In fact, hospital admissions peaked at less than a quarter of that. SAGE, the scientific body that advises Her Majesty's government, submitted a report in mid-December based on the work of its various modelling teams, showing a range of plausible scenarios in which deaths from COVID would peak, they said, at between 600 and 6,000 a day. Actual deaths peaked at 210 per day, nowhere near even the most modest projections of the SAGE modelling teams. Now, Christopher's reason for posting this thread, I suspect, was to encourage people to treat with skepticism the projections being made about hospitalizations and deaths in the run-up to this Christmas, if the government failed to impose COVID restrictions again. So Christopher's point was, if the modelers had got it so badly wrong last Christmas, why should we take their projections, their apocalyptic projections, seriously this Christmas? And we didn't lock down. But, and this is a really critical point, I think, from the point of view of the lockdown enthusiasts, both then and now, that wasn't a knockdown argument. Christopher's thread didn't land. Yes, the hospitalizations and deaths, the infections from Omicron at the end of 2021 weren't even in the lower range of the reasonable worst-case scenarios, but that didn't prove, in their eyes, that the models had got it wrong or that the government was right to ignore their warnings. Why? Because the definition of reasonable worst case is not the scenario that will probably emerge in the do-nothing scenario, merely a plausible one, assuming the assumptions plugged into the model are correct. Consequently, the fact that the actual figures for hospitalizations and deaths at the end of 2021 were far lower than those envisioned in the reasonable worst-case scenarios doesn't mean the models were wrong. Rather, the job of the modelers is to sketch out a range of plausible scenarios in the event of the government doing nothing, which, while they might be improbable, should nonetheless be factored into any decisions being made by policymakers. That's why the modelers are so insistent that the output of their models are projections, not predictions. In the eyes of those clamouring for Boris Johnson to lock down, to impose another full lockdown at the end of 21, it was his responsibility to do whatever he could to mitigate the likelihood of the reasonable worst-case scenarios materializing, even if the probability of them materializing was low. In light of this, the fact that they didn't materialize, even though the government did nothing, or more or less nothing, is neither here nor there. It was still irresponsible of Boris Johnson not to lock down, just as it was irresponsible of Rishi Sunak's government not to reimpose COVID restrictions this Christmas. And by the same logic, the lockdown enthusiasts are unimpressed when lockdown skeptics like me point to the fact that Sweden had, according to some estimates, fewer excess deaths in 2020 than every other country in Europe, in spite of the fact that the Swedish government didn't impose any lockdowns in 2020. The enthusiasts might acknowledge, I think, that the harm caused by the lockdowns in the rest of Europe was, in all likelihood, greater than the harm those lockdowns prevented, and yet still defend the lockdown policy. The relevant counterfactual is not what in all likelihood would have happened if European countries hadn't locked down in 2020, but what could have happened in a reasonable worst-case scenario, a projection, not a prediction. Given that European governments couldn't rule out that these scenarios would materialize, it would have been irresponsible of them not to mitigate that risk by locking down, even though it was perfectly foreseeable that the harm caused by those lockdowns would probably be greater than any harm prevented. That's why the British government, and I suspect every other European government, believed it was right not to waste time conducting a forensic cost-benefit analysis of the impact of the lockdowns before taking the decision to lock down. There's an anecdote in which a minister called Jesse, can't remember his surname, was at a meeting of COBRA, which is the emergency committee that takes big emergency decisions. He was at the meeting of COBRA, where the decision was taken to impose a lockdown across the UK in March 2020. And before everyone left the meeting, he piped up and said, has any sort of cost-benefit analysis been done of what the likely impact of the lockdowns will be and whether they will, in fact, in all likelihood, prevent more harm than they cause? And he got general looks of confusion and bewilderment. What was he thinking? Cost-benefit analysis? He clearly just didn't get it. And I think in a sense, he didn't get it because there wasn't any point in doing a cost-benefit analysis. Had they done so, that analysis would have shown, I think, that in all likelihood, the cost of locking down would outweigh the benefit. And I'm thinking of the economic harm of shuttering businesses, the medical harm of suspending cancer screenings and other preventative health checks, the educational harm of closing schools, the psychological harm of stay-at-home policies and so forth. That was irrelevant as far as the British government was concerned. The point of locking down was not to avert probable harm, but to mitigate the risk of possible harm. That's why there was no point in carrying out an expensive, time-consuming cost-benefit analysis. Even if that analysis showed the lockdowns would likely cause more harm than good, locking down would still have been the ethical thing to do because they couldn't rule out the possibility, improbable but possible, that not locking down would result in a catastrophic number of deaths from SARS-CoV-2. As the philosophically minded amongst you will have spotted, the logic that every Western government, with the exception of Sweden, applied in March of 2020 is exactly the same as that of the 17th century French mathematician Blaise Pascal. I'm thinking of Pascal's wager. So Pascal's wager goes like this: God may or may not exist, but it is rational to behave as if he does and become a believing, observant Christian, since the cost of not doing so, if he does exist and the Bible is true, is greater than the cost of doing so. You may think it's improbable that God exists, but that's not a rational reason not to believe in him and obey his commands, since the cost of disbelieving and disobeying, eternal torment in the fires of hell, is so astronomically high. Given the imbalance between these two costs, given that the cost of not being a pious Christian is higher by an order of magnitude than the cost of being one, it is rational to believe in God, even if you think the probability of him existing is very small. Now, I'm interested in what I'll refer to as this Pascalian logic, since it didn't just inform the response to the pandemic of most Western governments, but it's also the rationale for mitigating the risk posed by climate change. Just as governments around the world thought that they were justified in curtailing our liberty on an unprecedented scale in 2020 and 2021, Lord Sumption, former Supreme Court Justice in the UK, said it was the greatest, what happened in 2020 was the greatest interference in liberty in British history, including during wartime. They thought they were justified to mitigate a range of scenarios that were plausible but not probable, so these same governments believe they're justified in curtailing our liberty to mitigate the risk of catastrophic climate change without carrying out any sort of cost-benefit analysis. The cost of imposing top-down measures designed to curb our carbon emissions is immaterial, because if we fail to reduce our emissions, the cost could be higher by an order of magnitude, hence net zero. The analogy might not be immediately obvious, because advocates of net zero and other policies to mitigate the risk of catastrophic climate change often argue as if the probability of that risk materializing if we do nothing is not just higher than 50%, but close to 100% certain. And no doubt some climate change activists, Greta Thunberg for instance, genuinely believe that. Indeed, exaggerating both the cost of climate change and the probability of those costs materializing has been adopted as a deliberate strategy, not just by climate activists, but by governments and international organizations. And that's partly informed by game theory, and in particular something called collective risk social dilemma. So a series of psychological experiments have been done that show that if you want to encourage individual participation in costly corrective group behavior, such as investment in renewables, both the scale of the negative consequences of failing to engage in that behavior and the likelihood of those consequences materializing have to be set as high as possible. That's a deliberate strategy, deliberate exaggeration. But we shouldn't forget that the projections, those catastrophizing about the risk that climate change poses to life on Earth, the projections they're relying on are in fact reasonable worst-case scenarios spat out by climate models. The climate scientists themselves, the more rational ones anyway, acknowledge that the probability of their model's most catastrophic projections materializing is less than 50% and may even be as low as 5%. These scenarios are plausible, but not necessarily probable. Nevertheless, they think humankind has a moral duty to reduce carbon emissions, and indeed should be forced to do so by governments and international governmental institutions like the EU and the UN to mitigate the risk of these improbable but plausible catastrophic scenarios materializing. Indeed, the debt that net zero advocates owe to Pascal was spelt out explicitly by Warren Buffett, the American investment guru. Quote, Pascal, it may be recalled, argued that if there were only a tiny probability that God truly existed, it made sense to behave as if he did, because the lack of belief risked eternal misery. Likewise, Buffett said, if there is only a 1% chance the planet is heading towards a truly major disaster, and delay means passing a point of no return, inaction now is foolhardy, unquote. Climate contrarians like me often gleefully point out that the predictions that climate alarmists have made in the past haven't come true. For instance, Paul Ehrlich, author of the 1968 bestseller The Population Bomb, told the New York Times in 1969, quote, we must realize that unless we are extremely lucky, everybody will disappear in a cloud of blue steam in 20 years. That takes us up to 1989. He also predicted America would be subject to water rationing by 1974 and food rationing by 1980. In 2004, Observer readers, a British newspaper, were told that Britain would have a Siberian climate in 16 years' time. That takes us up to 2020. Temperatures did drop to -5 in December of this year in London, but we don't yet have an Icelandic climate, let alone a Siberian one. Peter Wadhams, a Cambridge professor, a climate professor, interviewed in The Guardian in 2013, predicted that Arctic ice would disappear by 2015 if we didn't mend our ways. In fact, Arctic summer ice is actually growing. In 2009, Prince Charles said we had just 8 years left to save the planet. That takes us up to 2017, while Gordon Brown announced in the same year we had just 50 days to save the Earth. But for the more serious-minded advocates of policies like net zero, the fact that these scenarios didn't materialize is no more relevant than the fact that the projections of the pandemic modelers didn't materialize at the end of 2021, or that no lockdown Sweden suffered a comparatively low number of excess deaths in 2020. These scenarios were only ever reasonable worst case, not predictions of things the modelers or the advocates of reducing carbon emissions thought were likely to happen. They were possible, but not probable. So the fact that they didn't happen doesn't in any way invalidate their projections, which weren't predictions. Before talking about what arguments we might use to challenge this Pascalian logic, I want to talk about one more area of public policy informed by this reasoning, namely curbs on free speech. For instance, it's the rationale employed by large social media platforms like Facebook, from which I'm currently banned, for suppressing the speech of those who question the efficacy and safety of the mRNA vaccines. Those platforms, or those browbeating them to remove vaccine-skeptical content, such as the UK government's counter-disinformation units, believe it's responsible to remove that content because they take it for granted that the mRNA vaccines and boosters alleviate more harm than they cause, and it's possible that not removing this content will boost vaccine hesitancy. They don't know it will. Indeed, they may accept that the likelihood of it doing so is actually quite low. But nevertheless, if there's a risk that the content will cause just one person not to get vaccinated or boosted, they believe they're justified in removing that vaccine-skeptical content. The same rationale is used to justify the removal of content questioning the claim that we're in the midst of a climate emergency, that extreme weather events are caused by climate change, for instance, and challenging the wisdom of policies like net zero. If it's possible that such content might discourage people from reducing their carbon footprint, not probable but possible, then they're justified in removing it. Finally, Pascalian logic is used to justify passing laws prohibiting hate speech. The argument isn't that such speech will necessarily cause violence to be inflicted on those it's targeted against, such as women and girls, or even that it's likely. The argument is that it's possible, not probable, but possible, that hate speech will result in violence, and that alone is reason enough to ban it. So now that we've identified that Pascalian logic informs the curtailment of our liberty in these three separate but important areas, the three greatest threats to liberty in the contemporary West, I think, what arguments can we make to challenge this logic? What can we say in defense of liberty? One place to look is at the arguments made by philosophers to discredit Pascal's wager. One obvious rejoinder is that belief in a supernatural being is so fundamentally irrational, it can never be rational to modify your behavior just in case that being exists. But that doesn't apply to reasonable worst-case scenarios, since they're produced by computer models created by epidemiologists and climate scientists. They bear the imprimatur, the authority of science, or rather the science. Another line of attack is to point out that the selection by policymakers of what low probability but high consequence risks, that's what we're talking about here, low probability but high consequence risks. You can point out that the selection of which low probability, high consequence risks to safeguard against is somewhat arbitrary. For instance, why aren't we building expensive defenses against the possibility of an asteroid strike, or colonizing other planets as refuges just in case the Earth is invaded by aliens? Those are low probability, high consequence risks. But if you propose those policies, you'd be laughed out of court. More prosaically, instead of just banning the sale of new diesel or petrol-fueled cars in the UK from 2030, which is currently British government policy, why don't we just ban cars altogether? After all, every time you get in your car, it's possible you'll kill someone, even if it's improbable. What is the rational basis for curtailing our liberty to reduce the likelihood of some low probability, high consequence risks, but not others? The advocates of large-scale policy interventions like lockdowns and net zero have an answer to this objection, which is that the reason for prioritizing some risks above others is because if they materialize, they will disproportionately affect vulnerable, disadvantaged, historically marginalized groups. That's the rationale for imposing permanent mask restrictions by an American group calling itself the People's CDC. It's a collection of academics and doctors who are part of a broader coalition of left-wing public health activists advocating for more persistent COVID mitigations. These activists believe the reason the state has a duty to mitigate the risk posed by COVID-19 is because the infection fatality rate is higher for disabled people, elderly people, and overweight people, and because black and minority ethnic people on average have less access to healthcare, they too are more vulnerable to COVID-19. One of the policies recommended on the People's CDC website is that all social events should take place outside with universal high-grade masking. They'd want events like this completely prohibited. Opposing this policy, the activists argue, is ableist, fatphobic, and racist. Lucky Tran, who organizes the People's CDC's media team, says, quote, "A lot of anti-mask sentiment is deeply embedded in white supremacy." You may not take activists like this and their demands for permanent COVID restrictions seriously, but I genuinely think this combination of extreme safetyism and left-wing identity politics is a potent and dangerous cocktail. The New Yorker described it as, quote, "a kind of moralistic scientism, a belief that science infallibly validates lefty moral sensibilities," unquote. This moralistic scientism, I think, undoubtedly informed the zero COVID policy in New Zealand, as well as the draconian lockdowns in parts of Canada and Australia, and the pressure to lock down in Christmas 2021 exerted by independent SAGE, the British equivalent of the People's CDC. Independent Sage issued a press release on December 15, calling for an immediate lockdown, December 15, 2021. One of the organisations that funds the People's CDC is the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the CEO of which, Richard E. Besser, is a former acting director of the CDC. Professor Susan Michie, one of the members of Independent Sage, is also a member of SAGE. According to this recent article in The New Yorker, this coalition of public health activists is, quote, influential in the press, unquote. And that's certainly true of The Guardian, which published the People's CDC manifesto last year. Much of the campaigning for net zero and other policies designed to reduce carbon emissions is also rooted in a kind of moralistic scientism. Our duty to mitigate the risk of climate change, these activists argue, isn't just because climate scientists have proved that a climate catastrophe is plausible, but because the negative effects of climate change disproportionately impact the global south, or the global majority, as it's now referred to. So what can we say in response to this moralistic scientism? How can we resist it? Well, one argument is that the policies imposed in an attempt to avert these low-risk, high-consequence eventualities that will disproportionately harm vulnerable groups, those policies designed to protect those groups are harming exactly those groups, the groups they're designed to protect. Example, when schools were closed in the UK during the lockdowns, children from low-income families were much more likely to suffer learning loss than those from middle or high-income families. They've also proved these children less likely to return to school since schools have reopened. The Centre for Social Justice published a report last year showing that 100,000 children are now missing from the education system post-lockdown. They haven't returned to school since schools have reopened. And the report found that children who were eligible for free school meals were over 3 times more likely to be severely absent than their peers. Similarly, deindustrialization policies in pursuit of a net zero goal are more likely to harm people in low-income countries than they are people in middle or high-income countries. Indeed, that was one of the arguments put forward at COP27 for why the first countries to industrialize, such as the UK, should pay reparations to African and Middle Eastern nations that we want to deindustrialize. But if you point out that the measures designed to mitigate the risk of these low probability, high consequence events that are going to disproportionately harm marginalized people, if you point out that the measures designed to protect these people are actually disproportionately harming them too, that argument just doesn't land. I made that argument a number of times during the lockdown. Don't you realize, left-wing person, that these policies you're advocating are disproportionately harming the very people that you claim to care so much about? The poor, the vulnerable, the elderly, the sick. No, didn't land at all. Fell on deaf ears. The arguments, these arguments never seem to land with advocates of large-scale, top-down policy interventions to mitigate low-probability, high-consequence risks. The notional harm caused to vulnerable, disadvantaged, historically marginalized groups, the notional harm of not doing anything, engages their sense of moral duty far more powerfully than the actual harm caused to these groups by the measures designed to protect them. Anyway, that argument, in my experience, doesn't really work. Another line of attack is to appeal to the scientism of the advocates of these policy interventions by pointing out that there's no such thing as the science, in the sense that there are very few, if any, scientific hypotheses that are completely settled, including the claim that global warming is caused by anthropogenic climate change. And even if they were settled, to argue that they proved we ought to implement certain policies would be to commit the naturalistic fallacy, to infer an ought from an is. Indeed, the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries wouldn't have happened if positive hypotheses hadn't been disentangled from normative ones. One variant of this scientific objection to scientism is the argument that the reason we shouldn't allow high-level policy decisions to be based on the projections of supposedly scientific models is because those projections are, by definition, untestable. Yes, we can point to predictions that haven't come true, At Davos in 2020, Greta Thunberg said we had 8 years left to save the planet, so the clock is ticking on that one. But the more cautious climate activists will acknowledge that the reasonable worst-case scenarios they're warning us about are projections, not predictions, and when they fail to materialize, if we don't follow their policy recommendations, they can say, we just got lucky. In this way, the projections of the models, which are saying what's possible, not what's probable, can never be falsified. But as climate contrarians like me know, those scientific arguments also fail to land. Anyone expressing skepticism about net zero and similar policies is automatically branded a denier or the purveyor of climate misinformation in the pay of big oil. There's one final argument I can think of which will be familiar to the libertarians in the room, which is to acknowledge that humankind does have a moral responsibility to do what it can to mitigate low probability, high consequence risks, particularly those that will disproportionately affect historically marginalized people. But that policymakers simply lack the competence, the expertise to mitigate these risks. Ignorance, as well as the law of unintended consequences, means that even if we're concerned about these risks, we simply can't be confident that the measures policymakers are proposing will make them less likely to materialize. For instance, the lockdowns and other COVID restrictions didn't merely fail to reduce the spread of COVID-19 in those countries where they were imposed, but left populations more vulnerable to seasonal respiratory viruses, such as influenza, that's currently putting pressure on the NHS. Encouraging people to scrap their existing cars and buy new electric cars may not result in a net reduction in carbon emissions, since the carbon emissions resulting from the production of a single new electric car are so much greater than those produced by an existing diesel or petrol-fueled car, at least within a 10-year horizon. By the same token, we could point out that historically, speech restrictions have disproportionately harmed marginalized groups. Abolitionist meetings were banned in some southern states before the American Civil War, while the American Civil Rights Movement would not have been able to organize, demonstrate, and march if the ACLU hadn't won some landmark First Amendment victories in the Supreme Court in the 1960s. But will that argument land? Won't we be accused of making the same old tired, anti-big state libertarian arguments, and probably in the pay of rapacious capitalists who want to avoid state regulation? I think this new hybrid of extreme safetyism and left-wing identity politics, moralistic scientism, will be the greatest threat to our liberty in the coming decades, and resisting it will be hard. I'm reluctantly coming to the conclusion that trying to persuade its adherents to be a little less alarmist, a bit more reasonable, by appealing to evidence and reason is misguided, in spite of their claims to be following the science. The reason these arguments don't land, I suspect, is because moralistic scientism has a lot in common with religious movements, with high priests, cathedrals, liturgical rituals, and so on. For the votaries of this cult, it provides them with a sense of meaning and purpose. It fills the God-shaped hole left by the ebbing away of the Christian tide. But one of the paradoxes, incidentally, of this moralistic scientism cult is that the more educated and the more intelligent you are, and the more credentialed you are as an expert, the more likely you are to be a votary of this cult. This isn't something that only misguided, uneducated proles are. In fact, they're much less likely to be bamboozled by it. It appeals to those with the highest status in our society. So I think to successfully resist it, given this religious role it plays in the lives of people who are so impassioned about it, we need something more than rational skepticism. We need an ideology, a moral philosophy of our own, something more optimistic, something that places a little more faith in the ability of human beings to voluntarily adjust their behavior in the face of existential risks, that trusts people to do their own risk assessments. A moral philosophy that recognizes the limits of science, particularly scientific models, that disentangles science from politics when it comes to informing public policy. A new enlightenment, And creating that, I believe, is the greatest challenge facing those of us in the skeptical, freedom-loving community. Thank you.